So let's kick it off. Welcome to Aclass Queer Voices. For those of you who've never attended one of these before, this is Acast's free workshop series aimed at celebrating and amplifying underrepresented voices in podcasting. And we're coming up to the end of LGBT History Month, so there couldn't be a better time to be focusing on queer voices in podcasting. So just a little bit of housekeeping at first. I've already seen that an anonymous question came in about if this session was being recorded. Yes, it is. And we'll be posting details of where you can watch the full session afterwards if you can't stay for the whole thing, but please do. Also, if you've got any questions at any point throughout this session, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A box. I see quite a lot of people have already found it, which is great. We'll be answering your questions with about 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the session. We're also going to be running some polls because I know these things can be, you know, you're sat behind a screen, you might fall asleep. We're going to keep you on your toes with a few polls throughout the session. It'll be really fun. Just to gauge your thoughts on what we're talking about across this evening. So without further ado, the structure, we're going to start off with a few introductions. We've got some lovely panelists tonight. We'll get them to introduce themselves. Then we're going to go through the panel discussion and, as I mentioned, the Q&A session at the end. So let's introduce everybody. I'm talking already, so I'll go first. My name is Mike Wooler. I use the pronouns he or him. I'm a content development manager at Acast. So what that means in English is that I find the best new podcasts to join the Acast network. And I also work with our larger partners on all things content related. And nobody asked alert, my favorite podcast is The Gossip Gaze. I didn't warn you guys to come up with what your favorite podcast is before this session, so you've got like a few seconds to think about it. So on to our first guest.
Hello, I'm Shivani. My pronouns are they and them. I occasionally present on the radio and I produce the Logbooks podcast. Besides my podcast, my favourite podcast, I'm going to do a bit of cross promo here. It's Out with Suzi Ruffell. Brilliant work.
Oh, thanks very much for saying that. Is it me next?
Am I going next? Yeah.
Yes.
Sure.
Okay. Are you finished, Shivani?
Yeah.
Sorry, that was me just going.
Yeah, that was me handing to you.
Oh, thank you. I'll take the baton. Thanks very much. Hello, I'm Susie Ruffle. I'm a stand-up comedian and I host a couple of podcasts. Out with Suzi Ruffell is one of them, where I interview people from the LGBTQIA+ community. And I also have a podcast called Like-Minded Friends, which is a podcast that I host alongside Tom Allen, where we chat crap. Shit, really. I mean, we just chat. So I said to the guys yesterday, someone once described it as gay white noise, and then was like, it's brilliant. And that's a really positive thing. And so I really like that. I would say if you joined the call as it opened, if you ran through the doors, as it were, I was just saying how much I'm enjoying the Logbooks. I've listened to 3 episodes today, so I think they're brilliant. And I also love the podcast Griefcast. Don't know if anyone's aware of that, because I genuinely love to cry. But yeah, it's a great podcast. But I'm really into podcasts, and so I'll listen to most things.
Awesome. I'll go next. I'm Alex. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a content partner manager at Acast, which basically means I help our partners and podcasters launch and grow their shows. I work specifically with our publishers at Acast, so that's the likes of BBC, Guardian, Economist. And my favourite podcast has to be Come On, Come Out, because it is satirical, it's hilarious, and yeah, I love it. Always makes me laugh.
Great. So there you have your panelists for this evening. Thanks so much, guys, for joining. So we're going to move on to the first topic in a second, which is about formats. But I promised polls and I shall deliver. Hopefully a poll should pop up. Be good to know, just from all of the people joining right now, how many of you already have a podcast?
Are we supposed to do this poll? Oh no, we can't vote.
We're not allowed.
We can't vote. Okay.
Unless you're not allowed. It's audience only.
I do 3 podcasts, so I think if I start another one, I think it's too many. I think
maybe, yeah.
Maybe I think 3 is about enough.
I don't know if there's such a thing as too many podcasts.
There's
okay,
not.
Fine.
We have to say that at Acast, but there's not.
Okay. What we need is the countdown music here. And now I need to learn how to. Oh, here we go. Okay.
Ooh.
70% of people have not yet launched a podcast and 30% have. Now, what I will say is, regardless what your answer was there, I think what is contained within tonight's session is going to be highly relevant to all of you. So yeah, really, really good to get an idea of whether or not you already have podcasts. Very interesting, very interesting. Okay, so finding your format. So what makes a good queer format? I thought to introduce this session, we're going to talk a little bit about our panelists' own podcasts and what they're all about. First of all, let's introduce their shows through the medium of audio, since this is a podcasting panel.
What if we told you that we had an unseen, handwritten chronicle of LGBT plus life?
There's a charity called Switchboard, a helpline for anyone who wants to talk about sexuality and gender identity.
And since 1974, their volunteers have written callers' stories into logbooks.
These unique pages are being brought out of the archive in a new podcast by me, Tash Walker.
And me, Adam Smith.
If you want to hear untold stories from Britain's rich and messy queer history, join us in the logbooks.
Messy indeed. Okay, and on to like-minded friends.
Hello, I'm Tom Allen.
And I'm Susie Ruffle, and together we host a podcast called Like-Minded Friends. Tom, how would you describe it?
Well, I suppose it's two homos talking about love, life, and culture when we get round to it. Yeah, so it's just sort of something for the lonely, I suppose.
We are two UK-based stand-up comedians, and we think that you might enjoy it. So please listen to Like-Minded Friends. That's all from us. Okay, bye.
Bye now. Bye-bye.
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 Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Great. Okay, so those are our panelists' podcasts. Really great shows. So just aside from all of this, go and check them out when you get a chance. Starting off with the logbook, Shivani, it'd be great to know kind of where the idea of the podcast came from. What made you want to tell stories from LGBT history?
So let's start at the very beginning. In 1974, a charity called Switchboard started, and they used to keep handwritten notes of the callers' concerns, problems, issues, and they used to also use it as a way to communicate to each other about the big issues in queer history and to discuss how to deal with some of the issues that some people might be facing, and how to best help and advise them. 2 years ago, almost to the day, the co-chair of that charity, Tash Walker, whose voice that you heard, found the logbooks and decided to present them for an LGBT History Month event. This guy, Adam, who you also heard in that snippet, went up to her and was like, "This is a podcast. I hear it now." And the two of them rolled me in because I had very recently done something about the charity Switchboard for Radio 4, where I was working at the time. And Tash phoned me and was like, "We want to make a podcast, but we need your help to do it. Do you want to be part of this?" And from doing the research for the Radio 4 piece, I had completely fallen in love with the charity and the work that they do, and how much help they give to people and what support they give to people. So I was like, yeah, sure, I'll do it. I had to get approval from my boss first, and he was like, yeah, go off, do it, it's fine. I don't think any of us ever thought it would be an award-winning podcast or like something that seems to touch so many people, but we just did it because we were three queer history nerds who just wanted to make a podcast to kind of learn about our own history, because we're all LGBTQ plus in one way or another, and it turns out that we were actually pretty okay at doing it. So yeah, that's pretty much the story of the logbooks.
Very humble and award-winning as well, might I add.
Yes, and award nominated today.
And it's exactly, oh, congratulations. So not just an okay podcast, a very, very good podcast. Thanks for that, Shivani. Susie, tell us about Like-Minded Friends. Where did the idea come from?
So Tom and I, Like-Minded Friends has been going for a while now. I think it's 6 years in November. So we were, I wouldn't say early adopters, but it was certainly before lots and lots and lots of comics had stand-ups. Now, lots and lots of stand-ups had podcasts rather. But I think, yeah, I think that we were some of the first comics to get into it. I knew that a lot of American stand-ups were doing podcasting, and Tom and I are really, really good friends. We go on holiday together. We always live together when we're at the Edinburgh Festival. We always just had a real laugh together. And so we wanted to put something out that was sort of very us, unapologetically queer. It's called Like-Minded Friends because we found that word as a slang for gay people in the 20s, when you could say that you could, or queer people, however you like to describe yourself, if you wanted to be able to talk openly, you could say, oh, well, he's a like-minded friend, she's a like-minded friend. You know, you can talk openly in front of them. So we liked that. And it started off with a lot more format than it has now. We used to come in and be like, we've got this idea. This week we're going to talk about, I don't know, sometimes we would take on huge subjects like, you know, homophobia within the comedy scene. And then other times we would take on subjects like tiling a bathroom. It would be really random stuff. And now it's more a chat. Now we just chat to each other. We talk about what we've been up to. We talk about the different work that we're doing, being on tour. Tom's been writing a book, doing TV. It's all different stuff. But now it's just a conversation between two very openly queer people. And we just wanted to put something out there that was positive about our experience.
That's great. And obviously with Like-Minded Friends, it seems like it's completely evolved in terms of structure. Out with Suzi Ruffell seems to have a bit more of a structure. It seems like you've got, you know, your questions.
Yeah, for sure. So I would say that very little work goes into Like-Minded Friends, other than more than a decade of friendship. That's what goes into Like-Minded.
It's a lot of work.
It's a lot of work to stay friends with him. No, it's not. Yeah. But yeah, Out with Suzi Ruffell is, I like, if they've written a book, I read the book. I always want to make sure that I'm asking questions that they're not being asked all the time. I think you can really tell when there's an interview when someone's just done a cursory Wikipedia glance. So I really try to create an interesting interview for them that they're engaged in. And also I want to create something that they're really happy with the product. So I always say right at the beginning, if I make any mistakes, please pull me up on it. If I get anything wrong, if I misquote you, if I say anything that actually you don't quite agree with, please be really clear, because I'm quite happy to be corrected on the podcast, because I think that's a positive thing. I think people get things wrong all the time, and that's okay to be like, oh, I got that wrong. But also it's very, very important to me that every podcast I put out is the people listen to it and go, this is a really good representation of me. It's really positive, and I'm really pleased that chat exists.
So when you were thinking about which format to use for which podcast, was it very much dictated on you want to honor the relationship that you've got with your interviewee without, so you want to really structure it, but it was easier with Tom to sort of make it more fluid?
Well, I mean, Out's only existed, so I'm way more experienced as a podcaster with Out. So as I say, Like-Minded Friends has been around for nearly 6 years, and Out I started in February whilst I was in lockdown, because I felt in the first lockdown a bit disconnected from my friends, from my community, and I knew that I wanted to do an interview show. I like interviewing people, and I had all this time on my hands, and I just wanted to put something out that was really positive about the queer experience. And so I knew in doing something like that, it would take a lot more work than Like-Minded Friends, which is basically a Zoom call. And I think it's really important, you know, if I'm talking to someone or I'm taking on big subjects about intersectionality or about, you know, we're taking on huge subjects and people are sharing their coming out stories with me. And so I think that I need to give them a lot of respect because they're doing that, and I really appreciate it, and I want to interview them with a huge sense of kindness. So it's really important to me that I do a lot of research, and hopefully it doesn't feel too structured. I want it to feel like a conversation, but at the same time, you know, it's important that we cover the harder stuff and the easier stuff alongside each other, because I don't want the podcast to be I want it to be rainbow rather than black and white. I want it to include a lot of things.
Yeah, definitely. You do it very well.
I don't know if any of that made sense.
It did.
Okay.
It was very
I've been talking in circles. As you can see, when I've not structured, it's an absolute mess.
Really, really broad one from me to kind of wrap up this section. And it might be a really hard question to answer, but what makes a good queer podcast, in your opinion? And this is one to both of you, really.
That's really hard.
It is, sorry.
I think what makes a good podcast on the whole is a couple of different things. having like a passion for the subject. I don't really want to listen to a podcast where it sounds like the person hosting it would be happier looking out the window. So like a really strong passion with research and knowledge that I'm probably not going to have from just a quick Google of the person, especially if it's an interview, like Susie says. Like if Susie's interviewing Tom, for example, I want to find out more about Tom than I would if I just Googled him. And that comes from like the passion and the skill of the host. And just, I think there are lots of podcasts out there that don't quite know what they are yet, whether they're like funny, whether they're storytelling, whether they're like factual. I think kind of just having an understanding of what the podcast is, so knowing what you are trying to achieve and being focused in that, because Susie's got like 4 podcasts, I think she was saying.
I've got three.
Great. Okay, and then the podcast that we'll co-host together will be 4.
That's the 4th. Yeah.
So like you can have multiple different podcasts that all do different things with different focuses, and just making sure you're set on knowing what each podcast is and having its own sort of identity. Because if you really like Susie's work, you'll listen to Like-Minded Friends and you'll listen to Out. But if you're just really interested in the interviews, you've got that one place to go to as an audience. And so I think just understanding what your podcast is and making sure that you're consistent for your audience is really, really important. But Susie's probably got something more.
No, I don't. I was just about to say, I completely back everything that you were just saying. I think having a real passion is about what you're talking about. I think you're so right that you can tell when people are sort of half in to something that they're selling. I think that if you want to create something, like really get into it, find out what the nitty gritty of it is, and really and really sort of dig deep into it. I don't think that one podcast needs to be all things. I think you can do, if you're interested in, I don't know, one specific place in history, do a podcast just about that and just focus in on it. Because I think it's interesting what people get geeked out on. I've listened to so many podcast series that are about sort of one event, and it could be like 8 episodes about this one thing, and you just get into it because there's all these different routes and all these different stories within this one big story. So I'd say, yeah, be really into what it is and go at it with a real passion. And I think releasing them weekly on the same day, which is something Tom and I do not do because we're really disorganized with Like-Minded Friends, but without, it goes out every Monday for the whole series. It's there when you wake up, if people want to, if they're going to work, listen to it on the way to work, listen to it on their morning walk. I think that's really important. Would you agree, Shivani, that it's sort of there same day?
Yeah, and we do that with the logbook. So we release in seasons because it takes a lot of work and research to get the stories and the
voices. It must take loads.
Oh my gosh.
I think that it must be a huge amount of research.
It's so much work. Like when we're in full research mode, I don't think I actually switch off for like the whole week.
So what do you do? Do you do research for the whole series and then record it, or do you do it in bits? Yes, sorry, Mike, I'm sort of taking your job.
This is all great because it's part of this section. It's
fine.
It's all very cool. It's great.
Okay.
I think it's really useful.
So what we do is the podcast's been running since the logbooks have been sort of running. The charity's been running since 1974. What we've done is we've split the logbooks into chunks. So the first season was 1974 to 1982. The second season was 1983 to 1991, and there's going to be a third season after that. And we go through all of these logbooks, which are handwritten, and I'm dyslexic, and some of this writing is really hard to read and really scrawny, and the helpline was 24 hours. So you've got people sort of just like scribbling stuff in at like 3 a.m. So we go through all of the logbooks and we try and find stories in a particular theme. So there's an episode on nightlife, there's an episode on section 28. There are 3 episodes on AIDS and HIV because we couldn't cover that whole issue in just one episode. So we split it up into lots of different themes based on like what stories seem to pop up. And we use the archive to bring these issues to life. And we speak to people who were alive at the time, who are either previous volunteers or just people who have stories to share. Through our research.
How do you find those people? I know the people that are at the Switchboard, you might have their name or something, but how do you reach out to people that were sort of existing in that time?
Yeah, so it was actually really hard to start with. So we originally didn't speak to, we don't contact anybody. There's only one person who is a lawyer who used to do lots of work with the volunteers and with the people who would call Switchboard. He's the only person we've approached. Everybody else we sort of know personally and has been able to guide us in the right directions about getting to different people, or people come to us now.
Of course.
And so what we've done is, so we've spoken to people who were volunteers in the charity who we knew personally, and we would say, oh, we're looking to talk to somebody about this in the 80s. Are you friends with anyone who, you know, particularly has a good story around this or came across this issue or whatever? And they'll say yes or no, or me, I was the person who had to deal with this whole issue. And so we try and find people that way. But it's really hard because the people who we're talking to were probably in their 20s, or they were over 16 in the 70s, 80s and 90s. They had to be over 16 to be a volunteer at the charity. And so what we found was that people tend to be older, the people who we speak to, and a lot of them aren't, you know, connected with me on Twitter or aren't on Instagram. So it's been a real different way of trying to find people, as opposed to just tweeting like what you see a lot of people tweet at the moment, like journo request. Has anybody got a story about this? I've done that, but it's a very different process to getting these contributors. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, no, it's super interesting. Stuff. I was nodding.
I think
that's really interesting.
Just to sort of sum up this format section, I think what you guys were saying about really figuring out what you want to say and what the right format is for that is amazing advice for new podcasters, because you don't and you shouldn't have to cover everything because it gets too broad. Find out your niche, find out what you're trying to say, and there are so many different formats out there for you. So there's documentary style formats, there's interview formats or monologue formats, there's even bulletins. Like there's so much out there. So just have a look online, see all the different formats and just see which one suits what you want to say on your voice best, and then it will be authentic and it will work.
Well said. Okay, shall we move things on? Right, so the next topic we wanted to talk about was representation in podcasting, finding your voice. So one of the things with traditional media has always been issues with representation, and over time that does very slowly, I'll admit, feel like it's starting to change. So while it's not perfect, podcasting does kind of seem to provide a space where queer creators from various intersections of society can make content for niche audiences that more mainstream mediums might be kind of struggling to serve. So in your opinion, what makes podcasting a great place for queer people to amplify their voices and tell their stories? What is it about podcasting that's unique?
Do you want to kick it off?
I mean, I'm obviously coming from a comedy background where you've got to, I mean, everything's sort of under my own steam, getting gigs and doing stuff like that. But I think that with podcasting, no one was going to stop me. I was going to put my voice out there. I wanted to create something. I don't have to go. I mean, Shivani was saying before about working at Radio 4 or working in radio. You know, I've pitched so much stuff. I actually pitched out to Radio 4 and they just never got back to me.
I pitched the logbooks to Radio 4.
Yeah, and so there's always these gatekeepers that are sort of going, well, no, we've got this, we've got that. I mean, they often have a lot of time and money for some people from Oxbridge, but that's a different conversation. But it's, I think it's the fact that you can just put it out there, and that's why it's become such a great medium for all types of people, because there's not a gatekeeper saying, well, you can come in and you can't, and there's space, there's room, because, you know, the podcast sort of realm is infinite. So people can just keep creating stuff until they find the right thing that they want to be creating, so I think that's the thing where, once upon a time we might have been like knocking on the door of Radio 4 or other local radio stations or documentaries or trying to make something for telly. Now, I mean, it's up to me how much I make it. I put all the effort in, I can create it and I can put it out there, and hopefully people would enjoy it.
Yeah, I totally agree. I pitched the logbooks to Radio 4 and I bet they're kicking themselves now, because we've managed to achieve like a lot of what the BBC is trying to target in terms of, our listeners tend to be like 52% women and men, and statistics aren't more nuanced than that. So that's all we get to see, and like the age group that they're targeting as well. And it's exactly what Susie was saying. Like there are these gatekeepers who, for one reason or another, you sort of have to not just have a good idea, but they have to like you. They have to be able to put their money where their mouth is when they invest in your idea in there. And for a lot of people, it's quite hard to get that. I was working there and I struggled to get that. So the entry bar to podcasting is so low because all you need is a device to record on and an internet connection. I mean, in the very early days of podcasting, I did and I hope I have deleted all evidence of this on the internet, but I did like a daily podcast, which was me on my phone, just recording very basic, like awful jingle that I'd put together in and out. And it was terrible, and I'm so glad no one's ever going to hear it again, and I don't think anyone ever heard it in the first place. But the bar is so easy to get into podcasting that you can just do these things and play around and have a tinker and learn the ropes. And then if you're good, or even if you're not good at the start, and if you develop and you get good, then the world is your oyster.
Yeah, totally, we agree. And there's also issues in other mediums of intersectionality, and as you say, the bar with podcasting is so low. A lot of LGBTQIA+ podcasts are still white male gay men, so does there need to be sort of more non-binary, trans, lesbian representation? And that's something that we really want to do with these Aclass, is give away this knowledge so we see more of this out there. And that's like the part of this, because it's not perfect in podcasting either at the moment. But one question I actually wanted to ask about podcasting is, from both of your experience with other mediums like TV and radio, do you think there's something about the more intimate nature of podcasting that lets people open up more with sort of queer stories? Because obviously it's not going out live, people can't see your face, all of that. Do you think that helps?
I think it helps massively. And like, my background is as a journalist, and there is something that we often find as journalists, is that your contributor will sometimes feel like they don't trust you, or they feel like their words might get taken out of context. And if you're a podcaster and you don't necessarily have that organization behind you, which might have a particular representation one way or another, then you might feel a little bit more confident as to be yourself, as to be able to just put your voice out there, because you're going to have a chance to retake what you say. You're going to have a chance to correct yourself if you're wrong. You can fix everything in an edit. That's what I think. And it works so much. And I think people do trust that. And from working in radio, there's this whole thing about how radio is very intimate. And it is very intimate, but podcasting is even more intimate, because you have to sort of, rather than it being broadcast out, people come in. That's how I look at podcasting. People come into the community that you've created, if you're a podcaster. Which I think is this really nice space of people who just have a similar interest or enjoy a particular comedian or a particular type of story.
That's such a lovely way of putting it.
Yeah, I totally agree. I love that idea of bringing people in. And I think that often with a really good podcast, it's overhearing a conversation. It is just a conversation between two people, whereas, when you're making something for telly, you know, it's out, it's to people, but yeah, it is just a conversation. And that's the sort of podcast that I like to listen to, where it feels like I'm just overhearing something that is smaller.
I think there's another side to that as well. The intimate nature is not just about the content itself, but there's a kind of cliche that every young British gay guy grew up with, which was the show Queer as Folk, and everybody has a story of watching it in secret in their bedroom with the TV turned down really quietly, and podcasting kind of provides a sort of safe space for young queer people to discover content that kind of, matches them, tell stories that they can relate to without having to hide that from other people. So I think that's a really interesting kind of role that podcasting has to play, not just in media, but actually in society, and as a tool for young people to use. So I think it's just another side to the conversation there. Shall we move on? Because I know there's a lot of people that have been probably hoping to hear some more kind of practical advice on how you actually make a podcast. There's a pandemic on, if nobody noticed. Very hard to not notice. So with social distancing likely to be with us for the next few months, it'd be good to know how you panelists have been making your shows. I know yesterday when we caught up about this, Shivani was actually putting together a microphone to record at home. And I suppose how can technology allow people to make podcasts from their bedrooms?
Do you want me to start this, seeing as we just talked about my beautiful new microphone?
You've got your mic in shot. I can get mine in shot if you want. There we go.
I think I got this literally yesterday and have only used it for Zoom calls, haven't actually used it for podcasting yet, and it's from work, so it's not actually mine. But like I said earlier, like I used to do a podcast literally just from my phone, like recording into the microphone on my phone and just like uploading it to the internet. And it was awful, but it was a podcast, and that's where I have the skills in just being able to like learn how to make a podcast, and just learning what something like an RSS feed is, or learning about like the furniture of a podcast, or things like uploading regularly to get, my mum to know when to click the link to get that one listen I would always get. But so you don't need any equipment really, unless you've like, all you need is a phone and an internet connection. I have done reports for the BBC underneath a blanket using the microphone on my headphones that came in the box with my phone. So like nothing fancy. I've reported for like the World Service with that method, literally just a blanket on my head to stop the echo, which basically just means that it just sounds a little bit warmer. It makes it feel like you're in a room together rather than like in a bathroom, which is still a room, but it's a nicer sound basically if you've got something.
Whereas I do all of my podcasting in the bathroom because I just like that sound. That's just my stuff. No, I'm joking. Sorry, carry on, Shivani.
Yeah, so it just gives it a bit of a warmer sound. So I put a blanket over my head. I used to just use the microphone on my headphones. Don't need any equipment. And then obviously you can be the kind of person that I am with all the gear and no idea, and you can invest. But you don't need to. Like, you can make very good content without having anything, because stuff on your phone is actually really good these days.
Right. Solid advice right there.
Yeah, I would say that don't feel like you need to buy a load of stuff in order to be a real podcaster. As Shivani's saying, I think that you can use, headphones on this sort of thing, or on, or just talking into your phone. Tom and I have done a bunch of podcasts just talking into our phone. We would sometimes do it in a car because it would be nice and quiet in there. Now I use a mic when I'm doing it from home and I'm doing out, and like my friends at the moment, I do it with a mic. This is a gaming microphone because it's got a really high spec, but it was really cheap. Well, I say really cheap, but when you look at the realms of how expensive microphones can be, it was, I think, 60 quid. That's what I've done all of the interviews on. And I might get a couple of cushions that I'd put probably like both sides of the mic, like just sort of here. And that just sort of makes it sound even more intimate. Like Shivani's saying, the bathroom's a good place to say it does sort of sound like you're rattling around a big old house with no furniture in it. But yeah, just putting a couple of soft furnishings around the place, or a blanket, can actually make it sound like you're in a studio, as good as a studio.
Yeah, for sure. Basically, any hard surface will just bounce your voice off of it. So cover as many hard surfaces as possible. I'd like to ask you guys a quick question about editing. So one thing that we always say is embrace the edit. The edit is your best friend. But how do you guys choose what to keep in and what to edit out? Because obviously you might think that everything's really interesting when you're having a great time.
Well, I'm just going to let my cat in. I mean, I hate to be such a cliche, but she's literally crying at the door.
I don't actually know where my cat is at the moment.
Okay, you can come in.
Oh, he's sleeping on the bed. I've been informed.
I'm really sorry, guys. Right, okay. She was just crying at the door for me not letting her in. Shush. I'm talking about podcasting. It's very important. So
she's obviously got her own thoughts.
She's got her own podcast, actually. So I'll be really honest. With Out, I don't do any of the editing. That's my producer who does that. But with Like-Minded Friends, we don't have an edit. We just talk. And that's the easiest way to do it, if I'm honest. Like, that's if you you can script parts of it and parts of the conversation. I mean, it is a trickier way of doing it because you have to constantly be. But I think because Tom and I are so used to working live because we're stand-ups and used to just bouncing off each other, we never edit it. So it's just exactly what we think. But anyone that's listened to it, you are going to have to go in a second. This is borderline embarrassing now. I'm really sorry to the 185 people that are watching. Not having an edit, I think, makes it a lot easier.
Yeah. And what about you, Shivani?
I love an edit. I find that the stories that we tell in the logbooks are really powerful, and it's really hard to sometimes have to listen to them and think our episodes are like maybe 40 minutes long, and to think I've got 40 minutes of a really good interview with this person, and that could be a whole episode in itself. But it's hard. It can be really painful to sort of cut stuff up. But the way I do it is I listen to an interview, and I will not be like at my desk or anything. So I'll like listen to an interview and walk around while I'm listening to it. So I can't write any notes or anything. And sort of just look at whatever, the scenery, animals, whatever, plants, whatever. Let my mind sort of be a little bit distracted as I'm listening. And then I'll come home, patter around, do whatever, write down, like the next day or something, write down the things that I remember that really stood out from that interview or from that person. And I will go back through the audio that I have and find those bits and use those bits, because the bits that usually stand out are usually the best bits. And so the bits that I can remember the next day are usually the bits that I want to keep. And my co-hosts, or not my co-host because I don't host it, but my co-producers and the hosts, Tash and Adam, both didn't really have a whole lot of presenting experience. They've done a bit of community radio stuff, but I like to get them to say things over and over and over again, to make sure they get the tone right, or the terminology right, or the pronunciation right, or whatever. So it can be really useful in that sense to have a space to just edit, because I think when you're doing something delicate like with the logbooks, accuracy is really important.
Yeah, great tips.
Great tips indeed. So just to sum up, so that there's something you can take home from all of this, some quick and dirty home recording tips from us. So while you're recording, this is something we didn't cover off actually, but just if you are recording audio, keep an eye on the levels, probably go a little bit quieter than you think you need to do. If you clip audio, there is absolutely nothing you can do afterwards to fix it. So watch the levels. Another thing, this is like every single person who's ever worked with audio has made this mistake at some point. check and then double check that you were recording in whatever software it is that you're using. If you're not using a USB mic, there are loads of great USB mics out there at the moment, but if you can, try and record into an audio interface, which is a little box that kind of allows you to plug a microphone into your computer and has really great preamps inside it, which ensures really good sound quality, or a handheld recorder like a Zoom handy recorder. That's going to give you the best sound quality. We already covered off space, so if you don't have a space that isn't noisy, try recording under a blanket. Some people will go in a wardrobe, so you've got loads of clothes around you. Really, really useful tip.
If you want to get back in the closet.
Yeah.
That's the irony of this. Yeah, record a queer podcast from the closet if you need to. Other things like soft furnishings like carpet, curtains, sofas, all of that stuff really, really helps reduce reverb too. Microphones. Don't hold your microphone if you can help it. Put it on a stand. Susie just showed off her stand a moment ago. This just stops the vibrations from the ground. And I actually have the exact same one. If you touch the table, you might still get sound, so try and stay away from it. But using a microphone stand will reduce the level of vibration. If you've got guests with you, probably recording remotely at the moment, I would assume, just try and get all of your guests to have their own microphone if at all possible. Recording around one microphone is not a good look. It doesn't sound amazing. It might sound like somebody is on the other side of the room. But something to bear in mind is you don't have to spend a lot of money on microphones. The technology is so good. If you are recording in a good space, you record at the right levels. The difference between a microphone that costs you $50, pounds, whatever currency you're in, and a microphone that costs 500, the difference is going to be so minute if you were recording the right way. Only an audio engineer will really be able to tell the difference. And this is podcasting, so it's fine. And then just down to software, you can use free software. GarageBand is absolutely fine. If you've got loads of money and you want to use Pro Tools, absolutely go ahead and use Pro Tools. But there are so many free software packages out there that you can use that make this really, really simple and cheap to do. And then the last thing, because I made this mistake so many times in the past, if you are recording, back up your audio file. Check that you formatted your SD card if you use those, because sometimes they don't work. And then when you've recorded and you've got your audio file, back it up onto the cloud or into an external hard drive. Just do all of those things and you'll be happy, and your podcast will work and it will sound good and you won't lose your audio. So that's that. So that's home recording. Sorry,
just a quick thing. Should we just quickly say what everyone's using to record over Zoom at the moment? Because that might be quite useful. Or if it is Zoom, it might not be Zoom.
Yeah, of course. Sorry, do go ahead.
No, Susie, after you.
Oh God, we're both too polite. I use the video of Zoom, but not that ever goes out. And then we both record on QuickTime, which I always want to call Quick Step because I love Strictly. So we both just record it locally. One thing I will say, this is just a little tip, and it's something that I did for ages. If you're having a go at podcasting, you're getting into it, or you're new to it, I used to get really nervous and sort of do this sort of thing, just sort of fiddling or like playing with a pen.
Oh, and it's the pen click. It's when you do that.
I can't begin to tell you when you listen back how irritating it is. So if you have to, sit on your hands so that you don't make a noise, because I learned that the hard way by having to record loads of stuff. That's just a little tip from me. But yeah, currently I use Zoom. I occasionally use Zencastr, which is a thing that you can use for free. But I think the easiest thing to do is record it locally where you are. And if you're interviewing someone, locally where they are, and then put the files together.
And you can also record the Zoom audio as a backup in case they don't actually have to record it.
Belt and braces.
Yeah, I use Zoom. If I don't need video, I will ask the person to turn their video off, because it's usually like a slightly better quality. If your bandwidth, that's an IT term apparently. If your bandwidth isn't using up video, I had to call the IT guy to work this all out. If your bandwidth isn't using up video, then you get slightly better audio quality. So I try and do that. And it depends on what I'm recording. Sometimes video does help to be able to just see your contributor and be able to talk to them a little bit more face to face, make it a little bit more human. But I also ask them to plug in headphones to the computer that they're using and then use their phone to record locally, because most people have a phone and a laptop, and they usually have two separate devices. So I say to them, put your phone on your desk so that they're not sort of moving it around, sort of like doing this and getting the sound all shaky. So I just say, put your phone on your desk and just speak to me on the Zoom. And I get them to wear headphones so that it doesn't pick up my sound. And then what I do is I sort of merge the two tracks together, because I'll do the same thing on my end. And sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. It's always good to have the Zoom back up. I always prefer having like multiple saves of everything, because I'm very disorganized and things always go missing. So I like to get multiple versions.
Great advice, always.
So it's back it up, have backups of backups of backups, and then you never have to worry. Cool. So let's move on to interviewing, because we've already touched upon this a little bit. We talked about how you actually physically record an interview and what you use to do it. But part of what's so great about your shows is that they use interviews as a way of kind of telling interesting, funny stories. With it being such a central part of podcasting, you know, I would estimate that 70% of podcasts are based on the medium of interview. We thought it'd be really good to talk to you about how you go about things like sourcing guests, researching, and then conducting interviews. I know that you spoke briefly about this, Shivani, how you actually physically find your guests, but how do you go about interviewing them? What's the process?
I like to think of an interview as sort of like a directed conversation. I like it to sort of be a bit of a two-way street, and to listen to what they have to say and sort of bounce off that, rather than to go in with like a strict set of questions that you don't deviate from. So I think I usually like to do a pre-chat just to build a bit of a rapport with a guest. So just to find out a little bit about them, how they want to be introduced, sort of what kind of things they'd be comfortable to talk about, because it is always nicer when you can do an interview in one take rather than asking questions over and over again, because people sort of, their best answer is usually their first answer. So I like to, because often we talk about some really difficult topics. So I like to talk to them about sort of where their boundaries are, to make sure that I'm not crossing them when speaking to them. And make sure that I can get the best out of the interview. And then when we record, I just try and listen to what they have to say and try and bounce off what they're telling me. And usually with an interview, because of the pre-conversation I've had with them, I kind of have an idea in mind of where I want the conversation to go. So through my questioning, slightly lead the conversation down that way.
Great, really interesting. You also asked them about their boundaries before, because I suppose in interviewing such, you're essentially prying into their lives, and it's obviously important to set those boundaries before you start digging, I suppose. So, Susie, you've got two podcasts, one of which is totally not interview based, but I suppose you could class you and Tom talking as an interview of sorts. Let's focus on Out. How do you go about conducting interviews?
I everything that Shivani said was brilliant. I think that a directed conversation is a much better way of looking at it. I think trying to stick too much to, I'm going to ask this question and this question, like I want it to sound like a conversation. So it's more like, okay, so I'll cover some school stuff. They mentioned that in their book. I read this article where they said this thing. I'm going to bring that up at some point. Also, as I'm talking to them, I might note down something that they referenced earlier. If you listen to sort of really great interviewers, they'll bring the conversation back to something someone mentioned 10 minutes ago. And because you don't want to stop their flow. So they're telling you a story and they mention something. They go, oh yeah, I had this horrible time at school. But anyway, let's not talk about that right now. But and then this happened, and then if there's an opportunity later for you to go, so you said you didn't like school. Why was that? You might get the conversation might go in a way that you didn't really expect it to go. But it's about listening. It's about being really in the moment. and not focusing too much on the fact that you're recording it and that it's going to be something that you put out, just being in the moment, having that conversation with that person. And I would say do research, and if someone's written a book, or if someone's, you know, put something out there into the world, or written articles, I make a real effort to make sure I've read a lot of stuff. A lot of interviewees have said to me, wow, you do your research. When I was interviewing Dustin Lance Black, I mentioned something about his school days, and he was like, whoa, that's not even in the book. And it was because he'd mentioned it in an earlier interview. And so I also think that's giving people the respect of, you know, I don't earn a lot of money from podcasting. Therefore, the fee that I offer people is quite small. Some people don't take the fee, some people do. It's completely up to them. But I think that regardless of whether they're getting a small fee or not, I think it's very important that I respect the fact that someone is giving me some of their time. And so it's really important to me that I have done the research on them and I give them a really good interview.
I feel personally attacked. Joking, sorry.
One thing that I want to ask, and I'm operating on one headphone right now that's slowly dying, so sorry if I just suddenly go. But so I very much think you learn by doing. So, and you guys have both been doing this for a while now. So is there anything that you did at the beginning which you wouldn't do now when interviewing guests, or vice versa, that you now implement that you wouldn't have done at the beginning? It's a thinker, isn't it?
Yeah. I think at the beginning, I did make that mistake that Susie's talking about, where I didn't do enough research on guests. This is like a long time ago. I wouldn't do that now. But you know, the worst interview is when you've got something lined up with someone who is fascinating, and then the first thing you say to them is like, so what's your book about, or something like that. Like, just not having done any research. And that also comes back to what we were talking about earlier with having passion for the subject. Like, you need to believe in the stories that you're telling and the people that you're interviewing. And if you don't care enough to even read their book before you interview them, that's going to come across in the podcast, and no one really just do your research, I think, because I definitely stumbled a couple of times, and I wish I could have gone back and captured those stories in a better way.
I would say
very clear theme that's come up there.
I would say I think a lot of my early stuff sounds very nervous, and I don't really know what you can do to sound less nervous, but I think like trying to really enjoy the conversation and let the conversation just be a conversation rather than like a fact-finding mission is a better way of doing it.
Yeah, you're not a super sleuth trying to get to the bottom of everything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Just one final quick one from me, question-wise. We've slightly touched on it, but how do you go about building rapport with someone that you've never met? It's so important for a good interview. But
yeah, I try and, like I said, do the pre-calls. I'm on social media and try and find out a little bit about them before I chat to them. I just have a call and like a sort of completely no pressure. This isn't an interview. This isn't like going to be recorded. Like, let's just have a chat and get to know each other a little bit, because it's really hard, especially at the moment when you can't even say like, let's go grab a coffee. It's like, let's have a Zoom call. Do you want to stare at your computer screen? And I'll stare at my computer screen, and we'll try and be friends with each other.
And how about you, Susie?
I mean, I would love to be able to have pre-chats with people, but generally people will be like, I've got an hour on this day, and I'm like, yeah, great, I'll make that work. I would say, how do you build? I think like don't feel like you need to immediately get into the interview. Like, have a chit chat first. You know, oh, how's it going? What have you been up to? You know, oh, where are you recording in your house? Oh, that looks like, you know, I think chit chat at the top. Don't feel like you need to go, okay, here are my questions, let's get through this. I think you'd be far better having a relaxed 10-minute chat than a really forced 20-minute chat. Use the first 10 minutes to feel comfortable, I would say.
Yeah, great advice.
That's great.
And actually,
yeah.
one thing we always say is record that first 10 minutes. So even if it's very much like, what have you been doing today, or talking about like, you know, your cat or something, start recording, because people tend to, if you have that nice chit chat and then you say, okay, 3, 2, 1, we're recording, then people start to freeze up and they get sort of mic panic. So if you can start recording right at the very beginning, and that might make them feel more comfortable, and then you actually might get a great story as well. You never know.
Yeah, you actually sometimes hear that. People sometimes put that in the trailer, the sort of pre-credits
the intro
of a
kind of
podcast.
thing.
You might have a bit of, are you recording it? That sort of thing, which people seem to like.
Yeah, for sure.
All about the outtakes. Great. So I think it's time for another poll. We haven't done a poll for a while, have we? We've just been talking about interviewing. Now, this is an interesting one, because I've spoken to people who have said that they actually prefer doing these online interviews. There's something about it that makes them feel, which is completely counterintuitive, makes them feel kind of like they're at a distance, so they can ask more challenging questions. So for all of you out there that said that you already have a podcast, so that actually turned out to be a minority to our surprise. And that 30% of you, do you prefer doing interviews in person or virtually? What do you think?
Mm-hmm.
Give you a few seconds. This will be interesting. I'm pretty sure. Do you know what? I'm shocked. 50-50 essentially, virtually and in person. I'd love
That's
to
as close as the Brexit referendum.
This is literally Brexit. Hopefully there will be a deal. Great. So you've got your idea, you've made some great content, you've recorded some amazing interviews, and you've done it all with a great mic set up in a great room. Now the hardest bit is getting someone to listen. So every single podcaster faces this challenge, no matter how famous they are. They've all had to find an audience. Now both of our panelists have successfully found their own audiences. So in the next bit, we wanted to talk a bit about a way that you can find your audience. So this is essentially centering around promotion, marketing, things like your artwork, your show descriptions. Now, I've got to say that your podcasts are very different. So, Susie, you're a stand-up, and you have your audience from that. Whereas the logbooks it's come from the Switchboard, which isn't a stand-up comedian, obviously. How did you go about finding your audiences? I think it's going to be a really different approach that you both took. So, say you started from day one. You've got a podcast, you get it out there. How did you tell the world about it?
I mean, for me, it was Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, trying to, certainly with like-minded friends, we just put it out. I mean, we get quite a lot of listeners now, but we had so few listeners to begin with, but we just carried on making it. I think the consistency of it just being there meant that eventually someone would listen. Yeah, I think just putting it out there, putting tags on it sometimes, like hashtags on social media. But that was the main thing that I did. And then if you can get any press or getting on other podcasts, sort of cross-pollination can be really good. So having someone on your podcast, then having that person going on that person's podcast, that's what you'll find a lot of that with comedians. That I've done like the Richard Herring podcast, Off Menu, loads of different ones, comedian, and you'll see everyone pop up on each other's, which I think sort of helps you. That's how you do it, but that's quite specific. I appreciate from like a comedy standpoint, but unfortunately that's all I know.
But I think it's totally relevant still. You can lean on your community essentially. Like you're in the comedy community, so you can lean on other comedians and work with them and share the love a bit. And I suppose that extends to all sectors of society and every single genre. So I think that's totally relevant.
Yeah, my stand-up career hasn't been quite as successful as Susie's just yet, so I haven't had the same marketing.
But that doesn't mean that it's not going to.
Well, after our very successful Back in the Closet podcast,
it's going to be possible for you to not get on stage.
Yeah, so it's been a very different method. We started with no plan. We were making this podcast for us pretty much, and people like us. And very naively, we thought that we would hashtag on Twitter queer history or LGBT history, and people would come. And it was a slow burn. And it was a lot of telling our friends to listen. Like getting people to rate and review us, all those sorts of things. Rating and reviewing actually does really help people find the podcast. So if you do like podcasts, please think about rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts and other platforms. And then we decided to get Switchboard, which is the charity that we're partnered with, to start tweeting about it, which really helped. And we started using the contributors' voices who we speak to, and we sort of, every time there's a new episode, we now have a very organized document saying like, oh, this date there's going to be a new episode. This is in our action stuff. We've already like organized what's going to happen, so we know that there's going to be a release, and we know exactly what we're going to say about it, so that we're not all scrambling around. We do a consistent episode drop like weekly when the seasons are being released, because audiences tend to like something that is regular. And it's just really serendipitous that we have had very culturally significant other forms of media. So It's a Sin came out, and the logbooks is sort of like the real life stories behind the characters of It's a Sin. So lots of people have been talking about the logbooks off the back of that. Victoria Beckham, I don't know her personally. I've been trying to get to know her personally for a very long time. She keeps ignoring my DMs, but she did tweet about the logbooks, which was also just like a completely random thing. So there is like a bit of organic stuff. But yeah, like Susie said, the cross-pollination is great. Going on other people's podcasts, sending your podcast to loads of media writer type people, like Miranda Sawyer from The Guardian's written us up a couple of times, sending it out to all these different places and saying, hey, you need to fill a whole radio show, or you need to fill a newspaper. Why don't you give us a feature? That can help. Try and get creative with it. It's like, it's hard, but just try and get as many people to talk about your thing as possible.
Yeah, I suppose that's the goal, right? Just get as many people talking about it and hopefully listening. So we've got a few kind of points here to kind of rattle through as, again, some more quick and dirty tips to help people listen to your podcast. So one of the big things that we didn't really talk about too much here was artwork. And I think it's actually often quite overlooked. You know, you're making, here we go, you're crafting a piece of audio, and sometimes the imagery and the branding that goes around it can be sort of overlooked. So from our side, a few kind of quick and dirty tips. First thing is just keep it really bold, simple and easy to read. When you are on a podcast app on a smartphone, for instance, the thumbnail is tiny, like nobody can see it. So save the details for other things. I would say the key thing should be the title. That's the first thing that you want to really see. Use bold colors, you know, eye-catching colors. You don't need to see this as a kind of reason to not be creative. You can see all of these great podcast artworks that we've got on the screen right now. You know, they're all arguably quite creative, but they're still really clear and really easy to read. Something else to think about is the quality of the image as well. You know, there are lots of pieces of podcast artwork out there that I've seen that are pixelated, really blurry. The bit rate's not high enough. Just try your best to use the best quality imagery that you can use, and it's going to look as good as it possibly can do on all the platforms. Also, you know, if you're going to use some photographs, maybe of yourself and maybe of the guests, try and make sure they're also high quality. So that's artwork. There's another thing as well, because when you upload your podcast, you need descriptions, you need titles, you need metadata. So something to bear in mind is when you're writing the title for the episode that you're uploading, lead it with the most important information. So that's things like the guests, the topics. It might be a quote from the episode in one of the interviews, as you can see the logbooks do right here. Another thing to make sure is that make sure your episodes and series are numbered correctly. So the way that shows appear in most podcast platforms is that they'll come up chronologically. If those numbers are wrong, your episodes might appear in the wrong order. Nobody will be able to find them, and that's not good for anyone. Then when it comes to writing the description, a quick one, just try to get the key facts about that particular episode into the first sentence or so of the show description. So these are often truncated when you're looking on a smartphone, or even actually on a laptop or a big computer screen. If you've got a kind of standard blurb that you use every single episode, and then you put the episode relevant stuff at the end, nobody's ever going to see it. So keep that at the top. So those are some tips about show descriptions. And on to engagement. I think Alex got some tips about this.
Yeah, definitely. So actually, would you mind going to the next slide? Because I am totally not using the bullet points to figure out what I'm trying to say.
Here you go.
Okay, thank you. Perfect. Oh yeah, so the point about engagement was just, really finding out where your audience is. So very much like we talked about earlier about finding out what you want to say and finding the right format for it. Once you know what you want to say, figure out who you want to say it to, and then try and think about where those audiences might be. So it's going to be different for every different type of topic and format. So for example, if you are doing a podcast about a queer topic, then lean on your queer community on Instagram and other podcasters and also YouTubers. But if it's a news podcast, then that might be on Twitter, because it's a lot more text-based. People are going to be engaging a lot more with text. But if it's health and wellness, then go over to Instagram or even Pinterest, because that's when people are going to be sharing ideas and discovering things. So just really think about what you're trying to say and what fits best for your engagement. And also just, both of you, both Shivani and Susie touched on this, but with like cross promotion, it's free and it's really, really effective. So cross promotion can cover loads of different stuff. So that's guest swaps, as Susie mentioned, but also episode drops. So you could find a like-minded podcast and drop an episode of each of your podcasts into each other's feeds. Trailer swaps, do the same with trailers. All of those things, it's like you don't necessarily have to divide your audience between your two podcasts. You can leverage both those audiences for both podcasts. So it's really good. And then making sure that you are creating good quality social assets. So especially if you've got an interview podcast and you would like your guests to help your show discoverability, then they're much more likely to post about it if you create the assets for them. It's just a lazy form of humans. We all do it. If someone's going to finish recording a podcast and go home, they're going to probably pour themselves a gin and not think about it again. You want to get those assets straight into their inbox, make sure they're posting, just make it as easy and as smooth as possible. Also Facebook events, so like any networking kind of thing. So just going to events, networking, finding out other people in the same who are podcasting in the same community, figuring out how they do things as well. You guys are already doing this tonight a bit with Aclass, and actually Aclass is a bit of a love story for me, because I went to the first Queer Voices Aclass 2 years ago as an attendee, and then I joined Aclass like 3 months later. Thanks for the clap, Shivani. So yeah, just go to these things and talk to the right people and just grow your audience organically as well. And have I missed anything? No, I think all of these things that we've said. So artwork, keeping it bold, simple, easy to read, using eye-catching colors. Make sure you've got your copy and your metadata there. Engage where you think your audience is going to be, and hopefully you will grow an audience. Podcasting is a long game. It's probably quite important to say that. You don't get an audience overnight. So hopefully if you follow all these steps over a significant period of time, you can start to really engage with some loyal followers who actually will be more engaged than on other forms of media.
I'm so glad that you said hopefully, because it's really, really hard, but consistency is key. And something I think was mentioned earlier is about that regularity of release as well. So being consistent over time, but also releasing. If you're going to release, try, if you can, to release it as regularly as possible. So whether that's weekly or bi-weekly, take a pick, but do it bi-weekly. If you're going to do it bi-weekly, do it weekly if you're going to do it weekly. But yeah, over time, follow these rules. Hopefully you'll have a nice big audience in time. So we are going to move on to the Q&A section. We've had quite a lot of questions coming through, some really, really good ones. First one is from Chris, who said, I love presenting and interviewing, but I don't have any production experience. Should I do it myself, or should I find a friend who could produce it for me? Interesting.
How much do you want to learn about production experience? If you only really care about interviewing and presenting, and you don't think that you will actually be bothered to sit down and learn, then yeah, maybe if you've got a friend who's got that skill set, go for it. But what I love about podcasting is the fact that you can have a dab hand at it all. And I think it's a great place to just be creative and be experimental. So why not? Like, you can get loads of software for free. I would do it. I would learn. That's how I learned how to produce, just by experimenting with stuff by myself. And now I produce an award-winning podcast. So you could too.
Yeah, I'd say learn it. Like, I have minimal skill there, and I would like more of it actually. But if you've got time now to do that, you know, it might take you ages to begin with, but it's something that's only going to get slicker and quicker, and then you'll have a new skill set.
That's right. And the thing is, editing doesn't have to be a complex thing. It can be, at the beginning, a top and tailing job. So you just cut the ends off of the audio that you recorded at the most basic level. And as you get better, you can add to that complexity, maybe with a bit of sound design, and mixing and all of that stuff. So yeah, really good advice there. Not quite a serious question, but I do want to get the answer. This is from Sophia, who says, we love the cat and want to know her name. What is your cat's name, Susie?
She's called Velma Kelly, because I'm obsessed with musical theatre.
Amazing.
And that's the main character in Chicago.
That
is the best bit of information I'm going to be giving you tonight.
I'm sorry. Everyone's writing that down.
Yeah, write that down.
The next one is from Mars. He says, do you think one-person podcasts work? I think what Mars is referring to is kind of monologue-based podcasts. Now, I've got my own opinion on that, but what do you think?
I don't know that I've listened to any. To be honest.
Catherine Ryan's podcast is very successful.
Oh.
That is a monologue.
Yeah, sometimes. She sometimes has Bobby on it, doesn't she? But she's, yeah, I guess, yeah. I mean, she does it brilliantly. So yeah.
I think they work.
There's your answer.
Sorry?
Sorry, go on. My internet went a bit funny.
Oh, I was just saying, I think they work. I think they can work. It depends on what you've got to say, right? No one would go to a Susie stand-up show if she didn't have anything good to say. So just like that, if your podcast has something good to say, people will listen to it. If you're just talking about paint drying, I mean, there's probably a very niche community of people who would be interested in paint drying podcasts, but you're probably not going to get that huge reach. But that's, yeah, I think it works.
Yeah, I think the thing is with Catherine is that she is an outstanding comedian who is very used to monologuing. And I think that is a skill. I mean, Catherine's been a stand-up for about 15 years. So I think that monologuing, if you're really good at doing that, then that would be a great, really interesting podcast. But I would say if you're not, it might be a harder place to start.
But I kind of disagree with that, in the sense that I think it would also just be a great place to learn. So if you want to become a public speaker or stand up, or you want to do something where you need that skill set to be able to tell a story by yourself over a period of time, then it's not like you can go anywhere and try out anything in a room full of people at the moment. So why not try it out in a podcast and just learn those skills? Like what we were saying about producing, you don't necessarily have to start off as the best producer. You just have to start being a producer. And if you want to start, developing your storytelling skills as someone who can monologue, you can start with a podcast, and it's a great place to develop.
Yeah, no, I agree with that.
Totally.
And the scariest thing is starting, right? So all you need to do is actually start, and then you will, as you say, get better as you go along. You can't wait till you become the best, stand up or the best monologuer to do it, because we might never get there. So just pick up a mic and do it. One of the questions that somebody has asked is how you go about making an intro or a jingle. Did you guys have any hand in your intros?
The logbooks got music commissioned from a musician because we wanted to support somebody who has a skill set in something that we don't have any talent in, but also because they would just do a better job than we would. But I have tried to make my own jingles and stuff using things like GarageBand. It's not where my strengths lie, but it's good fun to try.
Know your strengths.
I would say similar. I'm not good at putting together a jingle or anything. Intros and stuff and just talking, I can do that till the cows come home. But you can find like jingles and stuff if you've got a friend that maybe plays an instrument or something, they might be able to do that, or they might be able to help you, or maybe you can play an instrument and then you can do something brilliant that I wouldn't have the skill to do. But I would say, with stuff like with sort of doing the intro of the show, I mean, that's something that you just sort of, you get better at as you keep doing it. Like we were saying about the monologuing stuff, I think with podcasting, what I've learned is it is just doing it over and over and over and over again that makes you good enough at it. Or you makes you improve, and then you can,
There's that quote by someone who's probably dead that's like, you can't be an expert at something until you've done like 1,000 hours of it or something like that. And that's
I don't think he is dead. I think it's Malcolm Gladwell, isn't it?
Oh yeah, you might be right. I think you are right, actually.
Okay, don't worry. It's the one book I've read.
So it's exactly like that with podcasting. You just got to keep practicing and keep doing it, and then eventually you get somewhat good.
And I think don't be afraid to not be brilliant at the beginning. Like if you listen to early like-minded friends, they're a mess now, but you can tell that we don't really know what we're doing, but people seem to love it and people jump on board, and people will go back now and go, like in the first episode we go, oh my God, could you imagine if someone listened to this in 2020? That's what one of the first things we say, and we get tweets all the time from people going, oh my God, I've just started listening in 2020. But it's some of it's good, some of it's not. There's some episodes that aren't that great. I'm really proud of Out. I think all of those, but that's because I've now had sort of 6 years being a podcaster, and I sort of know how to do it. But there's some episodes of Like-Minded Friends that are sort of hit and miss, and that's okay. It doesn't matter. It's okay. We learn a lot from doing it, and now we create something that has an audience and people enjoy.
Yeah, totally. And someone's actually asked a question about perfectionism as well. So we've just hit 2 birds with 1 stone. You don't need to be perfect. Just do it.
I think also in a way, like the beauty of podcasting is that anyone can do it, and it doesn't necessarily need to be perfect. Like I kind of like podcasts that are a bit more rough and ready, and you get to see the personalities of the people who make them, and you get a bit more of an insight into what that person is like, rather than having something that is a completely polished, finished product. It's kind of like when YouTubers went like from being teenagers in their bedrooms with like really terrible cameras and bad lighting to now just being like essentially having a film studio set up in their houses. I kind of prefer the old version where they're all just like having a laugh and messing about and don't really know what they're doing.
Yeah, on a digital camera that's turned in selfie mode.
Yeah, exactly. Like 4 megapixels.
Another question has come through from Anonymous. Is there anything lacking from the queer podcast scene at the moment? And is there something you want to see in queer podcasting that you're currently not seeing?
I would just say there's always room. Like, I think there's room. I think like if anyone's watching this and going, oh, but maybe that's been said, or maybe someone's done that, or maybe someone's done this. Like there's, like I do my Out podcast, but there are loads of podcasts about coming out. Like, I didn't come up with that idea of interviewing someone about their coming out experience. That's something that queer people have been doing but I mean, it's something that it's how queer people have connected for years, hundreds of years, I'm sure, where people go, oh, well, how did you do that? Or have you told anyone? And so, if there's something, there could be something that you're inspired by, but you do a slightly different version of that. I would say there's room. I don't know that I would look at it and go, is there something missing? But other people might look and go, there's something huge missing. But then if you see something missing, create it.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what it is. Like with the logbooks, I was sort of sat there like, I want to know so much more about LGBTQ plus history. And we always hear about stuff in America and Stonewall and things like that, which is great. And I'm fascinated by it, but I was a bit like, I want to know stuff that's a bit more close to home. And we went out and discovered it and put it in a podcast. And so if there's something out there that you're like, why are there no podcasts about what happens to paint as it dries? Make the podcast. Like just do the thing that you're passionate about.
Yeah, make space.
I don't know why I keep going back to that terrible example.
I like it. I'm really impressed that you're sticking with it.
I have a physics degree, so I could actually probably talk to you about it quite some time, about the chemical structures and the bonds.
I'm very impressed by that. I
could get a podcast out of it, I'm pretty sure.
I'm so excited to subscribe.
Please rate and review us.
Yeah, it really helps people find it.
One of the questions, which is quite, it's a very difficult question to answer. What is the best length for a podcast episode? Very contentious.
I mean, you guys are the experts, aren't you, at Acast?
Yeah, I was about to say, I don't feel like I've got the answer to this. You guys.
Do you know what? There is no real answer to this question, because
it's a trick question.
We when people ask us this question in our day-to-day line of work, we'll usually say it needs to be as long as it needs to be. But around 40 minutes is probably about right. But then there are podcasts out there that are 3.5 hours long that are super successful. There are podcasts that are 3 minutes long that are super successful. And I think the length of the podcast is going to be totally tied to what the podcast is. If you're telling stories, a longer podcast might be acceptable. If it's a really, really interesting interview with a great guest, and, to cut some of the great material that you recorded would be criminal, maybe it can be longer. I think the key thing is remembering the attention span of your listener. People don't have forever to listen to podcasts. I think things have changed a little bit slightly, because it used to be that the majority of podcast listening happened on the commute. Since the pandemic, people are working at home. The listening habits have completely changed, and we don't see the same patterns in listening anymore. So maybe you do have a little bit longer with your listener. I would say that as long as every single minute of your listener's time is made worthwhile, you're not wasting their time, then absolutely, it just keep it as long as it needs to be. If you think you could edit something out and the podcast would materially not be any different without it, then absolutely do that. So yeah, not an answer at all. I'm completely aware that was not an answer. It was just a kind of.
Also, I don't know whether you guys will agree with me, but mine are never the exact same length. There are some interviews on Out where I think, like the one with M&EK is a whole hour, and then there's other ones where it's 40 minutes, because that's how much time they had. That's the only amount of time that I could get with them on that day, or that's the stuff that they wanted covered, or they didn't want to share any more than that, and you've got to respect that as well. So I think, as Mike's saying, it's about just making sure that what you're putting out is the good stuff.
Yeah, I think sorry, go. Sorry.
I was just going to say, I think it's about format as well. Like for yours, Susie, because it's an interview podcast, or even like Minded Friends, where it's a chatty podcast, people they do settle into it. They either sit down or do something while they're listening, so you can have that variation in time. Shivani listens in the bath.
Sure.
Really relaxing, your dulcet tones. Whereas if you're going to have a sort of daily podcast, an informative podcast, you probably do want it kind of the same length, because people have a 20-minute commute or something.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, very much depends on what you're trying to say as well, I think.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, totally agree. Also, Susie, if you want to have longer episodes and you have the capability of that, feel free, because it just means a longer bath for me.
Okay, I will take that in. I'm going to think of you the next time I interview, which is next week. So you're going to be right in my head.
Thank you. Yes. Feel free to give me a shout out. I'll be screaming hearing that.
I will. I'll give a shout out to the logbooks.
Yes.
I'll mention them in the first.
A bit of cross promo.
Yeah, no problem. I'll do it in the first step of the new series. Not a problem at all.
Legend.
What we like to see. This is great.
I've got one more question here. So I'm conscious that we're starting to run out of time. So one from another anonymous attendee. This is about approaching people to be a guest on your show. Now, if you don't already have a name yourself, or your show's not already established, how do you get people to want to actually come on your show? Any tips?
I would say having an interest in them. You know, with the first series of Out, I have a level of platform as a stand-up, but certainly the people that I was going to have got no idea who I am. So I would just get in touch with them and say, like, I got in touch with Dustin Lance Black through a friend that works at Stonewall that knows him, that said, can she send an email to your assistant? And I just sent an email saying, I just loved your book. I loved your book so much. I thought it was brilliant. I want to create this podcast because I want to create a positive show about queer lives. And he was kind enough to come back to me. I will also say that I've probably got in touch with 50 people that have never got back to me. And you have to just shrug at that.
I think there's a lot of rejection in asking people to come on your podcast, because not a lot of money to be made in podcasting, especially when you're starting out, and so there's not a lot of money you can offer people unless you're going into your own pocket if you want them to appear on your podcast. So being nice to them, like being interested in them, like Susie says, and selling your podcast to them. So they might not have ever heard about your podcast, so you want them to like want to do it. You want them to be interested in it. If you're doing a podcast on queer history, get somebody who is interested in queer history and has maybe talked about that at events or whatever. Whereas, you know, you might not want to speak to somebody who's not got any interest in that at all. Just make sure that you're nice and polite to them, and then people tend to be a little bit nicer back to you, and then might say yes out of some sort of pity, which is, I think, why people say yes to coming on my podcasts. Hopefully, and also, you know, once the ball is rolling, it helps.
For sure.
And there are also like things where I know some people do podcasts where they're like interview one person, and then they say to that person, who you pick who we interview next. And
oh, that's cool.
So it's like a bit of a network thing, which is really cool. So there's lots of different ways to get people, and word of mouth is usually pretty good.
I would also say don't be put off if it's a bit of a hard thing to get guests. There are so many people that tweet me being like, why don't you interview so-and-so? And I think, and they never responded because they never got back to me, and I've tried 3 times.
Publicly shame them, out them.
But, you know, that's okay. You know, that it might take you a little while to find out how to ask people. And, you know, I would also say, I know we're coming to the end and you didn't ask me for my opinions, but to wrap up, but I would say, like, don't be afraid of things taking a long time to find its audience and to get out there. I think, like, the consistency of creating stuff, and even if you're creating something that doesn't end up being the podcast that a huge podcast, you might then go on to create another podcast. It might be your 3rd podcast that ends up being a real hit, but you have to go through 1 and 2 in order to get there. And enjoying the process and learning as you go, I think, has been a really fun thing that I've done with both Like-Minded Friends and Out.
And that's the beauty of podcasting. I know we're getting the signal to wrap up, but that's the thing. Like, you can completely mess up and make mistakes, and because there are no gatekeepers and there's no boss, there's no commissioner or whatever, you can just completely, you can swear, B, you can like just completely make mistakes and just go crazy with it, and have a good time. And it's the beauty of podcasting. So make mistakes on your first podcast and your second and your third, and eventually you'll get there.
Such great final thoughts, and that's why we love podcasting. It's just such a great medium, and long may it continue. Guys, thank you so much for joining us this evening, and thank you also to the 123 people that have stayed till the bitter end. Just some housekeeping for the end. We're going to be uploading this video. If you missed the beginning of it, maybe you would like to watch it all again, we're going to be uploading this to the Acast YouTube channel next week, so keep an eye out on our social media. We're on Twitter at Acast, we're on Instagram as at Acast Podcasts. Just a little freebie here as well for anybody that's stuck to the end and gets to actually see this bit. If you are looking for hosting at the moment, you can use the code ACLASS at acast.com/hosting. We'll give you 3 months free of paid hosting on Acast Open. So that's it. Thank you so much for coming along, guys, and I hope you found it really useful.
Pleasure.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Cheers, thanks so much. Good luck with your podcasts.
Yeah.
You too. Bye.